of Rome. Episode 140, My Three Sons. Well, live and in-person me is back. As you know, the History of Rome just spent the last 5 weeks bouncing back and forth between Italy and Turkey on the official History of Rome Roman History Tour. It was an absolutely fantastic time, and the answer is yes, we are planning to do it again, and the sooner the better. That said, there's nothing I hate more than beating around the bush, so let's get back into this thing. It's been 6 weeks since I last thought about the show, and I'm dying to find out what happens next. But there are 2 minor corrections I need to get out of the way before we can get on with it. First, alert listener Anthony caught me accidentally reversing syllables in episode 137, so the polarizing deacon who later became the polarizing Bishop of Alexandria should have been Athanasius, not Anathasius. Sorry about that. The second mistake is from episode 138 and is quite a bit more embarrassing. See, what happened is that I had just gotten Mrs. The History of Rome into the reboot of Battlestar Galactica, so we were pretty much watching it non-stop. At the same time, I personally also happened to be watching a lot of the HBO Rome series. Do you see where this is going? Unfortunately, despite my clear memory to the contrary, Saul Tigh never did say, "No one is a traitor until they are," although it really sounds like something he might say. In reality, Titus Pullo said it. He said it in Rome, Season 2, Episode 8, A Necessary Fiction. That he remembered Pullo saying something just like that, and I immediately knew I had botched the reference. It was an honest mistake in a time of great stress, and I hope that you will all forgive me. Okay, now that all the old business has been dispensed with, unless there are any objections, let's move on to new business. We left off last time with the death of Constantine on May 22, 337 AD. This week, I want to cover how his sons handled the fact that they were now in charge of the empire. As we will see, they will quickly prove that they are every bit their father's sons. It is difficult to pinpoint exactly where the boys were at the moment of their father's death, but it appears that Constantine II, the eldest of the 3 at 21 years old, was in the far west, perhaps even as far off as Trier. Constans, the youngest of the 3 at somewhere between 14 and 17 years old, was likely in Pannonia or northern Italy, while the middle son, 20-year-old Constantius II, was in the far east, readying for a campaign against the Sassanids. Of the 3 sons, Constantius will prove to be the most cunning, decisive, and ruthless of them all, and this became apparent right from the very beginning. Dropping everything, he rushed back to Constantinople and took it upon himself to immediately oversee the funeral and burial of the dead emperor before either of his brothers could arrive and share in the prestige of presiding over an imperial funeral. Savvy play. And he was just getting warmed up. Now, as we discussed last week, Constantine had laid out a fairly detailed succession scheme that involved splitting up the empire between his 3 sons and 2 of his nephews, Dalmatius and Hannibalianus. The latter was to hold some vague authority over the eastern borderlands, while the former was to be granted control of Thrace, Macedonia, and Achaia, which is to say, Dalmatius was to be in charge of Constantinople itself. The scholars have surmised that Constantine was attempting to set up a sort of neutral zone around the capital, so that no one of his sons would be able to claim it as their own, and thus throw the balance of power out of whack. But boy, was that ever not what happened at all. About 10 minutes after Constantine was laid to rest, Constantius II initiated what has since been dubbed the Massacre of the Princes, which was, yeah, exactly what it sounds like it was, a massacre of princes. To fully appreciate what Constantius II is about to do, we must unfortunately turn for a second to the insanely convoluted Constantinian family tree, which I can assure you is every bit as confusing as the Julio-Claudian family tree. I'll admit that as I parsed my way through the twists and turns of Constantine's extended family, I secretly began to thank Constantius II for killing half of them off in May 337, just because of how much it simplifies everything. As with the Julio-Claudians, there were 2 main branches to the family that were often at subtle odds with each other. On one side, there were the descendants of Constantius and Helena, which is to say Constantine the Great and his children. And on the other were the descendants of Constantius and Maximian's daughter Theodora. Constantius' second marriage eventually produced 3 sons and 3 daughters, giving Constantine a raft of half-brothers and sisters to deal with. You'll no doubt recall that one of these half-sisters, Constantia, was married to Licinius, and another, Anastasia, was married to the ill-fated Bassianus, who Constantine executed on trumped-up treason charges as he was preparing a case for war against Licinius. The third sister, Eutropia, wound up giving birth to a boy named Nepotioanus, which is noteworthy for 2 reasons. First, he will show up briefly in 350 AD running a counter-usurpation against Magnentius, and second, that means that he survived the massacre of the princes, despite all the talk about how Constantius Gallus and Julian were the only males from the Theodora side of the family to make it out alive. Probably he is little noted because he was the son of one of Constantine's sisters rather than one of Constantine's brothers, so with patriarchal rules applying, he just isn't considered that relevant. As for Constantine's half-brothers, the eldest, Flavius Dalmatius, had at least 2 sons that we know about, and, coincidentally enough, 2 sons that you know about too, the aforementioned Dalmatius and Hannibalianus, who were favored enough by Constantine to be brought into his succession scheme. The second brother, Julius Constantius, gave birth to 2 sons and a daughter with his first wife, and another son with his second wife. Now, I normally wouldn't bother getting that deep into all of this, but the thing is that of all the males on the Theodora side of the family, not counting Nepotioanus of course, only the youngest sons of Julius Constantius will manage to survive the massacre of the princes. 11-year-old Constantius Gallus, and 5- or 6-year-old Flavius Claudius Julianus, the future Emperor Julian the Apostate. So sorry for throwing all of this mind-numbing lineage at you, but I wanted to at least introduce these boys, so you know how exactly they come by their future imperial dignities. The last of Constantine's half-brothers was an elder Hannibalianus, who was probably dead by this point, so just forget about him. He will not be on the test. Over the course of his reign, Constantine had brought in all of these half-brothers and sisters into his imperial system, doling out key assignments to the brothers and key marriages to the sisters. Constantius and Theodora had started up their family about 20 years after Constantine had been born, so when the emperor kicked the bucket in 337, all of these brothers and sisters were in their late 30s and early 40s. In other words, entering the prime of their lives, ready, willing, and able to take on a greater role in government and help steer the fortunes of the next generation, the generation that had been granted formal authority by Constantine. But Constantius II had no interest in playing nice with the other children. With the whole of Theodora's extended family present in Constantinople for the funeral, Constantius II saw an opportunity to secure undisputed power for himself and his brothers, and he took it. Though the details are sketchy, it appears that ordered his uncles and cousins seized and executed. Their alleged crime? Nothing less than the assassination of Constantine the Great. Some contrived evidence was put forth to support the charge, but other than that, there was nothing resembling due process. All in all, 9 men from Theodora's side of the family were killed, and this of course included Dalmatius and Hannibalianus, the young men who were supposed to share power with Constantius and his brothers. As I just said, not counting Nepotioanus of course, young Constantius Gallus and Julian were the only ones spared, due entirely to the fact that they were merely children. But don't worry, Gallus too will eventually join his family by dying at Constantius's order in 354. In the end, only Julian will survive Constantius's wrath, and it's possible that was only because Constantius died before he could get around to killing Julian. So far as I can tell, Constantine's middle son faced no long-term repercussions for having ordered a purge of his extended family, and the Empire simply accepted that that was the way things went sometimes. That, and whoever might be inclined to dissent, just got put on notice that maybe criticizing the new emperor was bad for your health. Before we move off this, though, I should mention that there is another version of all this that depicts Constantius as merely allowing the massacre to happen, rather than ordering it himself. That is, the palace troops detested Theodora's side of the family so much that they were just itching to murder them all, and when Constantine died, Constantius II simply allowed their passions to run wild. But given every other paranoid and ruthless thing he did with his life, I am not at all opposed to laying blame squarely at the young prince's doorstep. It is in perfect keeping with all of Constantius's later tendencies. His two brothers, for their part, did not seem at all concerned about the massacre, and when the three of them met a few months later in Sirmium, they did not engage in any hand-wringing over the murders, so much as focus intently on how best to divide the empire between them. The map they agreed to adhered mostly to their father's boundary lines, with Constantine II receiving the far western provinces of Gaul, Britannia, Hispania, and Mauritania, Constantius holding all of the eastern provinces plus Thrace, which means he gets Constantinople, another savvy play, and Constans holding Italy, Illyria, Macedonia, Achaia, and the Middle African provinces. However, since he was no older than 17 at this point, and possibly as young as 14, Constans was forced to accept that Constantine II would be his guardian and hold a super authority over his territories until young Constans came of age. The youngest of Constantine's sons was no doubt annoyed by this, but he gave in, knowing that he would not have to wait long to be considered their equal. After all, his brothers were only 21 and 20 respectively. In other words, not really much older than he was right then, so it's not like they were going to be bossing him around for long. Emerging from the meeting, the three sons of Constantine were officially hailed as co-Augusti by the assembled troops, and then they marched off to govern their respective provinces. For Constantius, this meant heading straight for the Syrian border. You'll recall from last week that in the final years of his reign, Constantine inexplicably began to provoke a war with the Sassanids, which, as you can imagine, they did not take kindly to. Now that some untested punks were in charge of the empire, the Persians decided that now was a pretty good time to punch the Romans in the nose and maybe remind them why détente in the east was far preferable to war. So they started attacking Roman positions, and off Constantius went to try to stop them. We don't have a particularly good record of the subsequent campaign, but it appears that in the beginning at least, Constantius was repeatedly beaten and forced to scramble around a bit before he was able to find his sea legs, although nothing resembling a decisive encounter ever took place. Meanwhile, back in the west, Constantine II set up court in Trier and began surveying the territory that he now controlled. But when he surveyed the territory he now controlled, he quickly became convinced that he had been shortchanged. I'm not sure why he didn't just speak up during the meeting in Sirmium when this was all being hashed out to begin with, but he didn't, and so it's not until the winter of 337-338 that we begin to hear Constantine complaining that he deserved a bigger share of the empire because, after all, he was the oldest brother. One possible explanation is that Constantine was under the impression that he would be able to dominate Constans forever, and so he had mentally lumped his youngest brother's territory in with his own. But after learning that Constans had no intention of being dominated by anyone,